Tony Blair is the longest-serving Labour Prime Minister in British history. Alastair Campbell was for 10 years his closest confidant, friend and political ally. Campbell was the other man in the room. He attracted more attention than he wanted and caused more controversy than he planned. He wrote it all down, the good times and bad, in his personal diaries. They've been secret till now, but Tony Blair's departure from Number 10 frees Campbell to reveal the inside story on his years with Blair, the obsessions and the rows, the ups and downs of political life.
Tony said I'd been reckless and foolish and paid a price. So has Cherie, who had a terrible shock. I wept because of the pressures I was under and the sadness I felt for Kelly's family. Tony said, in truth, I've never really wanted to do more than 2 full terms. I did actually wonder whether what I discovered on reading my own diary would be so awful I would want to top myself.
It's 6 o'clock on Tuesday the 11th of September. Good morning, this is Today with Sue McGregor and James Doherty.
The headlines this morning: Tony Blair will address the TUC conference today and try to reassure union leaders over his plans for greater private sector involvement in schools and hospitals. The court in Melbourne has ruled...
I woke up to the usual blah on the radio about Tony and the TUC speech. All the old BBC clichés about us and the unions. We finished Tony's speech on the train, were met and driven to the hotel. We were there up at the top of the hotel putting the finishing touches to the speech when the attacks on the New York Twin Towers began. It was now even clearer than just a few moments ago just how massive an event this was. It's possible we were talking about thousands dead.
It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building. Move it! Come on!
We would have to make immediate judgments about buildings and institutions to protect here. Tony was straight onto the diplomatic side as well. Said that we had to help the US, that they could not go it all on their own. There was always a moment in these terrorist outrages where governments said we must not let the terrorists change what we do, but it was meaningless. Of course they changed what we did. At first we felt it best to go ahead with the speech, but by the time we were leaving for the venue, the towers were actually collapsing. We went over to the conference centre where Tony broke the news to John Monks that he intended to go on, say a few words, but then we would have to head back to London. Monks said to me, "It's on days like this that you realise just how big his job is." Tony's mind was whirring with it.
I know that you would want to join with me in sending the deepest condolences to President Bush and to the American people on behalf of the British people at these terrible events.
We set off for Brighton Station. Tony said the consequences of this were enormous. He asked for a pad and started to write down some of the issues we would have to address when we got back. He said the big fear was terrorists capable of this getting in league with rogue states that would help them. He'd been going on about bin Laden for a while because there had been so much intelligence about him and Al-Qaeda. He made a note of the need to reach out to the British Muslim community, who would fear a backlash if this was bin Laden. Everyone seemed convinced it couldn't be anyone else.
As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
As smoke blew across Capitol Hill, the heart of American democracy, it is clear that this is the biggest attack on America since Pearl Harbor.
Once back at number 10, Blair is briefed by the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, John Scarlett, and his colleagues about the background to the attacks.
Tony's immediate concern was that Bush would be put under enormous pressure to do something irresponsible. If America heard the worldview develop that this happened because Bush was more isolationist, there would be a reaction.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism.
He'd been reading the Quran over the summer. Muhammad had lost battles, but there was a belief that if you died in the cause you believed in, then you went straight to heaven. That was a very, very powerful thing to work against.
Bush and Blair speak on the telephone for the first time the day after the attacks. The president confirmed he would not launch a counter-assault.
Bush said the American people would give him a bit of time. He said this was a new war. These people had to come out of their hole sometime.
Our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share.
God bless you, Mr. President.
Appreciate you.
I felt Bush was almost zen-like, almost too calm. Maybe he had decided he could wait longer than we thought. Tony said we had to think of a way of getting to the US for a face-to-face meeting. He said he needed to see him in a room and look in his eyes and not do all this on a phone with 15 people listening in.
Tony Blair came to the magnificent Church of St. Thomas's on New York's Fifth Avenue to remember the British dead and missing, their precise number still unknown. Mr. Blair said it's a tragedy that's made the bonds of solidarity between Britain and America stronger than ever.
Your loss we count as our loss. Your struggle we take as our struggle. And I think the spirit that's been showing here in your city is just something remarkable. And it's that spirit that should inspire us to do what we now need to do to see this thing through.
Blair went on to Washington for dinner at the White House and took Bush to one side for a private talk.
They clearly embarked straight away on a very tough conversation. Tony emphasised the need for a measured response and that we needed to keep public opinion with us at all times. Bush said yes, but when I'm speaking tough, I'm speaking to Middle America, most of whom have never heard of bin Laden till now. They just know someone attacked their country and killed their fellow citizens, and they say, "Hey, Mr. President, go get someone, and why ain't you done it the day before yesterday?"
Bush paid Blair the ultimate presidential compliment, making him guest of honour at Congress.
I was worried about it because it would play into the whole poodle thing. John Kerr called to say it would be ghastly, that the whole thing would become an orgy of American patriotism, with Tony in a kind of nod-along role.
America has no truer friend than Great Britain. Once again, we are joined together in a great cause. So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
Back in Britain, Blair's first stop was the Labour Party conference in Brighton. where he set out the plan to pursue the terrorists in Afghanistan.
As for the Taliban, they can surrender the terrorists or face the consequences. And again, in any action, the aim will be to eliminate their military hardware, cut off their finances, disrupt their supplies, target their troops, not civilians. We will put a trap around the regime. And I say to the Taliban, surrender the terrorists or surrender power. That is your choice.
Extraordinary press for Tony's speech, though some found it a bit preachy, and there was a real danger of overreach. The speech was getting huge play everywhere, including one headline in the States that it was Tony's pitch for world leadership. We would have to watch it.
Within 5 days, coalition forces are attacking Taliban targets in Afghanistan. Persuading Pakistan to cooperate with the West to defeat the Taliban and capture bin Laden is a priority for Blair. But it's a dangerously volatile place for him to go right now.
The Security Committee, which advises on Tony's own safety, has met and would basically prefer that he didn't go. We had endless comings and goings on that, including Cherie coming to see me, quivering with rage, bottom lip trembling, telling me I was mad to allow it, and do you want to be a martyr or what? I pointed out that he had decided to go, that therefore I should probably go too, and that if we all went down, I don't think it would be me qualifying for martyrdom. I felt there was a danger now that the British public started to ask, what is this all about, and why is he spending all of his time on the needs of other countries and not our own?
Blair was promised support from Syrian President Assad. He instead gets a public lecture about American-sponsored terrorism in the Middle East.
Tony got an absolute mauling in the press for the Syrian humiliation, disaster in Damascus, etc. Way over the top in some ways, but there we are. Tony was trying to put his best face on after yesterday, and was comical in his description of it. It could have been worse, he said. He could have taken out a gun and shot me. I went out for a run, and loved the sounds of the city starting to wake up, particularly the calls to prayer. Tony once said if I was religious I'd probably end up as an Islamic fundamentalist. I think I know what he meant. I woke to the news that Kabul had fallen, with John Simpson seeming to claim that he'd liberated it.
This is it. We're walking into Kabul city. We don't seem to have any problems around us. There's only people that are...
All the armchair generals now moved from saying the military strategy hadn't worked to saying that we had f***ed up the diplomatic channels.
Blair is enjoying huge success on the international stage. But at home, it's a very different story.
Tens of thousands of commuters are facing travel chaos today because of a strike by rail workers.
I think the government is under real pressure. As you say, its own opinion polls are now suggesting that transport's the biggest single problem. And I think where the government's gone wrong, if you like, is that they've created so much in the way of expectations.
My first morning meeting of the year, as we went through the media brief, was like swimming through shit. Virtually every paper over every story is in knocking mode. Tony Blair, the great man abroad as seen overseas, was being whacked at home over absolutely everything.
And then there's the Chancellor for Blair to worry about. He has his own personal agenda and political ambitions.
Tony had dinner last night with Gordon and said he'd been on best behaviour, but it was still difficult. He told him he still believed he was easily the best person to follow him, but he was not going to support him in circumstances where he felt he was being forced out.
trying to control the press onslaught against the government and deal with the personalities at the centre of power does at this point threaten to overwhelm Campbell.
I was in early and went up to see Tony in the flat. It was dark up there and he seemed a bit down. He asked me if I was depressed. I said yes. Clinically, I mean, he said. I said I think so. He said my problem was that I was agonising, stay or go. He felt I would hate it if I went, no matter how much I sometimes hated it now. I needed to see the press as the inevitable downside of a job that had a huge upside.
Blair and Bush agree that Saddam Hussein poses an intolerable threat to the West, and that if they're to make headway against terrorism, Iraq will be their next target.
Tony wanted to be in a position to give Bush a strategy and influence it. We discussed whether the central aim was weapons of mass destruction or regime change.
Bush country, Texas. A world away from the West Bank, but as Crawford prepares to host Tony Blair, the talk here is of Middle East turmoil and how to get back from the brink.
Tony said it was the usual conundrum. Do I support totally in public and help deliver our strategy, or do I put distance between us and lose influence? He said what was sure was that this would not be a popular war, and in the States, fighting an unpopular war and losing is not an option. I went down to the gym in the hotel. There was an enormous woman on the treadmill. She heard me speak and then, as she padded at the slowest possible pace, asked me if I was English, then if I knew Tony Blair. I said I did. She said she was so happy that the world was run by two God-fearing young men, Bush and Blair. She asked if I was his bodyguard, and I said no. She said she prayed for Tony every day, for him to keep the world safe, and for his bodyguards to keep him safe.
Blair's preoccupation with Bush and Iraq gives Gordon Brown the opportunity to build up his own position in the party.
Tony's big concern about the Gordon situation was the feeling that ministers were unsure what their instincts were meant to be, because though we were the present, they realised Gordon was the future. Tony needed to be clear that they were answerable to him. I said there was a case for sacking one or two Brownite ministers to shake things up a bit. He was more up for it than I thought he would be.
By the middle of the year, Blair contemplates dropping a political bombshell to quash rumours about his leadership.
Tony asked if it was possible for him to announce publicly that he wouldn't fight the next election, and tell the cabinet that if ministers wanted to fight a leadership election, they would have to do it outside. I said he had to decide simply whether it was the right thing to do, and that if it wasn't, he was simply caving in to psychological warfare. Did he really want to go, and was it really the right thing? Tony wanted another discussion about his future, or la grande stratégie as he now called it. The only question that mattered was whether it strengthened or weakened him. I veered to the lame duck side of the argument. I wasn't convinced it was remotely time for him to go yet. Tony said, in truth, I've never really wanted to do more than 2 full terms. I said, Christ, how much can I get from the press for this one? He smiled and said, is it the right thing or the wrong thing? I want your best brain on it. Then he laughed and said, there's another complication. I think Cherie's pregnant. He said they were both absolutely gobsmacked by the whole thing. He had known for a few days. It had clearly had an impact on his thinking about the grand projet. I slept really badly. Lots of different worries just floating around. As for Cherie being pregnant again, it was mind-blowing.
Cherie had a miscarriage later that summer.
Tony called as I was driving down to France to discuss Iraq, and we agreed that we should start to push out some of the Saddam material.
Blair is determined to prove to a sceptical public that Saddam does pose a real threat to the world. This imperative triggers a set of totally unpredictable consequences. Every step and the motives of all the main players from this moment onwards will be subject to forensic examination. Unaware of what he's setting in train, Blair announces that publication of the dossier on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction is imminent.
We went through some of the hard questions on Iraq. The hardest was why now? What was it that we knew now that we didn't before? Tony said the debate had got ahead of us, so we were going to do the dossier earlier.
Originally I had the intention that we wouldn't get round to publishing the dossier until we'd actually taken the key decisions. I think probably it's a better idea to bring that forward.
Today was about beginning to turn the tide of public opinion, and it was going to be very tough indeed.
They now begin to accumulate new intelligence material to bolster the case for military action against Saddam.
Meeting with John Scarlett and others to go over the dossier. It had to be revelatory, and we needed to show that it was a new and informative part of a bigger case.
Never before has Tony Blair made such an important trip across the Atlantic, and never before has he enjoyed such influence in Washington. He's arrived here to tell George W. Bush to internationalize the Iraq crisis, to get him to agree that the path to a possible war should go through the United Nations.
At one point we had a break, and Bush shouted out across the room, "Hey, big guy." Tony wasn't there at the time, but I went over and Bush said, "I'll say this, your guy's got balls." He and I discussed our running. He'd done one marathon, and his mum and dad had come out to cheer him at 19 miles, and his mother had shouted, "There are 3 fat ladies ahead of you." As we left, Bush joked to me, "I suppose you can tell the story of how Tony flew in and pulled the crazed unilateralist back from the brink."
Back in London, work continues on the Iraq weapons dossier. Stories are emerging that MI6 is worried about the political use of their intelligence material.
I said I'll chair a group looking at it from the presentational point of view. John Scarlett thought there was an ownership issue. He said he must feel he has ownership of it. Then I did a note to John, copied very widely, setting out the process. John Scarlett to own, Alastair Campbell to help. I said the drier, the better. Cut the rhetoric. The more intelligence-based it was, the better. We had the basic story, and now had to fill it out. Tony looked at it, and felt it was pretty compelling stuff. I was worried that the dossier was going to be too assertive, that even though the agencies presented it as their work, it would be seen as us trying to spin them a line.
All the stops were pulled out to get the dossier together for Blair to present it to Parliament.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, including against his own Shia population, and that he is actively trying to acquire nuclear weapons capability.
The press seized on the drama of the 45-minute claim, which was accepted pretty much at face value. When accusations are later levelled at the government over the veracity of this claim, Campbell would be obliged to hand over his diary to a judicial inquiry. Then a call out of the blue to number 10 from the Cheshire Police. Are they aware that Cherie's friend Carol Kaplan's boyfriend, Peter Foster, is a convicted conman facing deportation from the UK?
I did a note for Tony saying the Foster story was clearly going to become public and that we had to have defensive lines ready, making clear he had never met him and that it was not true as he was saying that he was their financial advisor.
Foster's claiming he represented Cherie Blair in buying 2 Bristol flats where the Blair's son is a student. Number 10 responds to the Mail on Sunday's list of questions, denying any contact with him.
Prime Minister, good afternoon, sir. Do you regret your wife getting involved with Mr. Foster?
An exchange of emails between Cherie Blair and Foster is then revealed by the Mail, completely contradicting Number 10's denials.
Even though I'd half expected this, I was absolutely livid. We had given, in Tony's name, the clear impression that Foster was not their advisor, but these emails would show very clearly otherwise. Tony spoke to Cherie, and she agreed that we could make clear she alone was responsible for any misunderstanding.
Campbell's taking the majority of the flak for something he had no control over.
The papers were dire for Cherie, while the Mail and the Telegraph were really going for me. These issues where the political and the personal collide were always difficult. Tony was getting very agitato. He said, "I'm not having my wife treated like this and we have to fight back on the basis we've done nothing wrong." I felt that unless we let some air out of the situation, this was just going to go on and on. We were all now up for Cherie doing a big number. We went through things line by line. It was probably the best way to blow the storm out. I gave her the draft, and Peter Mandelson said she should pick out people in the audience and speak to them direct.
How are you this evening?
She looked at me and said, "I certainly don't want to look at him."
My immediate instinct, when faced with the questions from the Mail on Sunday, 10 days ago, was to protect my family's privacy, and particularly my son, in his first term at university, living away from home. Sometimes I feel I'd like to crawl away and hide, but I will not.
After the event, everyone felt a lot better. Tony said he was really proud of the way she stood up to it.
The fallout from the Foster episode had, however, put a terrific strain on Blair and Campbell's relationship.
Tony called as I was out on a run and said we just had to shut it down. I said to him the real problem was that whether you like it or not, you're linked to a con man. He said, "I resent that. You are. You're married to a woman who is determined to protect and keep a woman who is in love with a con man, so you're linked to a con man." He shouted at me down the line, "I am not linked to a con man. You are. And until Cherie dumps Carol, or Carol dumps Foster, or preferably both, that's the way it is." Tony was having none of it. "We have a fundamental disagreement. You think Cherie has done something monstrous, and I don't. You think Carol is monstrous, and I don't." I said I wasn't going to defend Carol or anything to do with her. "Fine. Don't then, just say nothing about it." "Fine," I said, "but if this goes on much longer, I'm off. Out of here. Goodbye."
The row shook Blair and Campbell. It took a day or so before things calmed down.
Tony said that if Carol stayed with Foster, they could have nothing to do with her. Also, even if she dumps him, he has to be more careful. I've been reckless and foolish and paid a price. So has Cherie, who had a terrible shock. But she is a good person, not a bad person. And you have to take us as we are, strengths as well as weaknesses.
Number 10 then releases further details of Saddam's brutal record in an effort to turn the tide of public opinion.
The government's carefully coordinated propaganda offensive took an embarrassing hit tonight after Downing Street was accused of plagiarism. Channel 4 News has learned that the bulk of this 19-page document was copied from 3 different articles, one written by a graduate student.
This gave them another spin story and was a real pain.
Campbell had responsibility for this report, which the press swiftly dubbed the dodgy dossier.
The dossier was causing a lot of embarrassment. Seemingly, whole chunks were lifted off the internet. It was a bad own goal. Definitely no more dossiers for a while.
And it did nothing to reassure the public that Blair's intentions on Iraq were the right ones.
Tony could barely be in a more exposed place now. We were in danger of looking like we were the bad guys, prepared to disobey international law.
As Britain takes to the streets in protest against a war, Blair is in Edinburgh to present his moral case for action against Saddam.
The first thing Tony said was that he'd slept badly. So had I. He knew that he was in a tight spot. He said, even I'm a bit worried about this one.
And as you watch your TV pictures of the march, just ponder this. If there are 500,000 on that march, that is still less than the number of people whose deaths Saddam has been responsible for. If there are 1 million, that is still less than the number of people that died in the wars that he started.
The problem was that for the moment it looked every part of the strategy was in tatters. We the EU, we the UN, we the Americans, we the party, we the country, which was on the march against us.
Don't attack! Don't attack Iraq! Don't attack! Don't attack Iraq! Don't attack! Don't attack Iraq!
We've never ever marched before. I've never been on a march before.
War is not the answer. War is going to create more problems than it solves.
A war would create more anger and frustration between the Muslims and the West.
TV was wall-to-wall, uncritical coverage of the march and the usual over-the-top claims about its size.
And how many people were there in Hyde Park? Inevitably, the estimates vary. The organisers were claiming more than 2 million.
I got more and more angry about the claims being made for it. The Mirror front page with a dying Iraqi child and the headline, March for Him, as if he was starving because of us. I got home and did an 18-mile run at just over 7 miles an hour. I bumped into no end of people coming back from the march, placards under arms, faces full of self-righteousness, occasional loathing when they spotted me.
By now, the likelihood of persuading sufficient countries to back a second United Nations resolution authorizing war was extremely remote. Without that authority, Blair could lose a vote in the Commons and then have to resign.
I asked Tony, if at the end of this he was history before his time, was this issue really worth sacrificing everything for? He said it's always worth doing what you think is the right thing to do. Iraq is a real problem. Saddam is a real problem for us as much as anyone, and it's been ignored too long.
Bush, Blair and Spanish Prime Minister Aznar meet mid-Atlantic in the Azores and challenged the rest of the world to join them in demanding that Saddam is disarmed.
It was President Bush who kicked off on a chilling note.
We concluded that tomorrow is a moment of truth for the world. Many nations have voiced a commitment to peace and security, and now they must demonstrate that commitment to peace and security in the only effective way, by supporting the immediate and unconditional disarmament of Saddam Hussein.
Bush asked about the Commons vote, said he was confident we would win. He said to me, if you win the vote in Parliament, I'll kiss your ass.
this is not the time to falter. This is the time for this House, not just this government or indeed this Prime Minister, but for this House to give a lead. To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right. To show that we will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk. To show at the moment of decision that we have the courage to do the right thing. I beg to move the motion.
Tony's speech was one of his very best, and we felt it moving our way. All of us, I think, had had some pretty severe moments of doubt, but he hadn't really. Or if he had, he'd hidden them even from us.
It was now, as they stand on the brink of war, that Campbell's partner Fiona, who works with Cherie at number 10, says she's going to quit.
She said it wasn't the war per se, but it had been the last straw. I said she should go if she wanted to, and try not to do it in a way that makes us an issue. She said, but you are a big issue, which meant that there was never a right time to go. It's true, there was never a right time, and this was about as unright as it could be. I told Tony about Fiona. He went into "this is ridiculous" mode. I said, Tony, you're talking about Fiona and I won't have it. He said, for God's sake, I was always talking about his wife. I asked what his plans were. I really don't know. I've never really wanted to fight a third election, but I don't know, I might. I asked if he had done a deal with Gordon. Not at all, he said, but he didn't rule it out. After going to bed late, then another row with Fiona over my leaving, and her demanding a departure date now, I was woken by a call at 3 a.m. Did I know action had begun? It turned out the US had some late, sudden intelligence on Saddam's whereabouts and went straight away.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Two weeks later, American tanks are on the streets of Baghdad, Saddam's troops are deserting. Campbell thinks this might be his chance to get out.
Tony asked how my situation was at home. I felt that unless I had an exit date, I had no marriage. He said he was really saddened, but he wouldn't put me under pressure to stay. He felt I would forever regret not seeing the whole thing through to the end. War Cabinet. Signs of regime collapse in Iraq were all around now. Claire Short was rabbiting on more than ever. I slipped Tony a note about the time Saddam shot his health minister at a meeting because he was annoying him. And did he want me to get a gun? Yes, he scribbled.
Blair goes to Iraq after the fall of Saddam to congratulate British forces in Basra.
I know there were a lot of disagreements in the country about the wisdom of my decision to order the action, but I can assure you of one thing: there's absolutely no dispute in Britain at all about your professionalism and your courage and your dedication.
It is now 7 minutes past 6. The government's facing more questions this morning over its claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Our defence correspondent is Andrew Gilligan. This in particular, Andy, is Tony Blair saying they'd be ready to go within 45 minutes.
While Blair is still in Iraq, the BBC broadcasts the first public allegation that number 10 included the 45-minute warning in its dossier on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, even though they'd been warned by intelligence advisors that it was probably wrong.
We've been told by one of the senior officials in charge of drawing up that dossier was that actually the government probably knew that that 45-minute figure was wrong even before it decided to put it in. Downing Street, our source says, ordered a week before publication, ordered it to be sexed up, to be made more exciting.
The government issued an immediate, unequivocal denial of Gilligan's story to the BBC, saying not one word of the dossier was not the work of the intelligence agencies.
I told Tony the papers were really pretty grim, and he was worried that the spooks would be pissed off with us. He kept saying, "What are the allegations?" And I said, "It's that we made them do something they didn't want to do." "But it's ridiculous," he said, and so it went on. Gilligan had a big piece with descriptions of meetings there had never been, and things I was said to have done that I never did. It was grim, and grim for me, and also for Tony, with huge stuff about trust. It was definitely time to get out.
Is this the guilty man? Did Alastair Campbell spin the country into a war that his boss had long ago made up his mind to fight? That's the grave charge that the Prime Minister today fought to knock down.
These claims are simply false.
One by one, he read out the accusations and declared himself innocent.
The claim about the readiness of Saddam to use weapons within 45 minutes of an order to use them was inserted into the dossier at the behest of Number 10. That is the claim that has been made. It is completely and totally untrue.
I went to the ballet with Fiona. I didn't like ballet at the best of times, and these were not the best of times. I've never been so stared at in my life. It was a mix of, he doesn't look too evil, and what on earth is he doing here? I wondered myself. WMD was still rumbling on with the BBC driving it as hard as they could. I felt I was being royally set up for a fall. Also, I'd been invited to the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Intelligence Committee to give evidence, so it was going to be a grim few weeks.
The allegation at the centre of this blazing row was made originally by the BBC reporter Andrew Gilligan, seen here giving evidence to MPs.
The dossier had been rewritten, transformed in the week before it was published, and I asked, so how did this transformation happen? And the answer was a single word, which was Campbell.
A week later, Campbell gets an opportunity to put his case to the committee.
Tony said he really wanted me to stay calm at all times and treat the committee with respect.
Till the BBC acknowledge that is a lie, I will keep banging on. That correspondence file will get thicker, and they better issue an apology pretty quick.
I got most of my lines in, and it went pretty well. It was gruelling, and I walked back exhausted. Huge coverage in the papers and some great cartoons. Generally, I was thought to have done well.
The BBC head of news does not accept that there's a case for them to answer.
Well, Richard Sambrook, you better issue an apology pretty quick, says Alastair Campbell.
We're not going to apologise for something we haven't said. It's as simple as that. Alastair Campbell can try and pretend we said all sorts of things we didn't say. We're absolutely clear about what we said.
And you deny that that report amounts to an accusation that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, Mr Campbell, and the heads of the intelligence services were lying and have led the country to war on a false premise?
Absolutely not. We have never suggested anything of that kind.
During the morning we put together a letter following Sambrook's interview and put it out to the press. I was going to nail Gilligan completely, and then the Mail.
Yeah.
I went with Callum and his friend to Wimbledon, but I was constantly being called out. Sambrook replied with real sophistry. Their line now was that it was okay to report a source, even if you didn't know what he said was true. I wrote a very angry response, probably too angry. I really went for it. I do not want 12 pages of weasel words, sophistry, and a defence of unethical journalism. Far better would be a 12-word apology that says the BBC allegations were wholly false and we apologise sincerely for them. I said the story was a lie. It is a lie.
Later the same day, the row escalated even further.
Jon Snow asked me to go on Channel 4. The office was split, half in favour, half against. I was tempted.
Yeah, that's fine.
I spoke to Tony, who said do what is appropriate and don't go over the top. I headed there, gathering my thoughts. Snow seemed not to be expecting me, but there I was.
Well, now we are joined by Alastair Campbell, a rare moment.
Did we abuse British intelligence? The answer to that question is no.
We don't know. The answer to that question is we do not know.
Excuse me.
And the reason we do not know is that there...
The people who have been opposed to this conflict from the word go are now seeking to change the ground and to say the Prime Minister led the country into conflict on a false basis.
Good to see you.
I felt I won it, read the words, but I did get a bit too angry. Fiona was livid I'd done it at all. She did one of her you never listen, never acknowledge anyone else's views numbers.
Throughout this period, Gilligan's source has remained a mystery. Then someone steps forward at the Ministry of Defence who thinks he may be it.
He was being interviewed today by the MOD. Yes, he said intelligence went in late, but he never said the other stuff. It was double-edged, but it would f*** Gilligan if that was his source.
The source is not a spy, he's a scientist with expert knowledge of WMD who advises government departments.
I wanted to get this to the BBC governors. Tony felt the guy had to be treated properly and interviewed again. I felt we were missing a trick.
Dr. David Kelly's identity as the source finally emerges a couple of days later.
David Kelly is an expert on chemical and biological weapons who works for the government. The Ministry of Defence identified him as a contact to the BBC journalist Andrew Gilligan. The hint was he was the main source, but he'd been quoted inaccurately.
The difficulty I have is that there are other elements of this which do match the things that I say, and I've referred to that, the issue of the 30% probability of Iraq possessing chemical weapons. That's the sort of statement that I do make, and may well have made to him. And that's when I became concerned that I may in fact be part and parcel of his story.
Do you believe that the document was transformed, the September dossier, was it transformed by Alastair Campbell?
I don't believe that at all.
I was told Kelly had gone for a walk yesterday, and his wife had reported him missing this morning. I felt sick. I could sense a juggernaut moving my way.
A body has been discovered in remote woodland in Oxfordshire, 2 miles from the home of senior government advisor Dr. David Kelly.
This was getting more and more grim. Then Tony came on. I said I'd really had enough. He said we should announce a judicial inquiry now. I said I really wanted to go and I felt I should do it now. Tony said it would be a disaster for me if I did that. Fiona was desperate for me to go. So was I now. I wept because of the pressures I was under and the sadness I felt for Kelly's family. Cameras started gathering outside at 6, and by 9 there were 4 or 5 film crews and a dozen or so photographers. Tony called. He said I had to stay and we had to fight this through.
The Prime Minister looked ill at ease as he was greeted by the Japanese Premier, Mr. Koizumi, today. This is a tense and difficult time for Mr. Blair.
While Blair is on a trip to the Far East, Campbell tells him he wants to step down by the end of this coming week.
Tony called during his visit and said it was a mad idea. I said it wasn't. He said that in the end we're all in this together and we have to help each other. Once the dust settled I would have to deal with the BBC, etc. And I would have no stomach for it at all. I hated these people.
Lord Hutton is appointed to head the inquiry into David Kelly's death.
He looked far too Tory for me, though as Fiona said that might mean he was pro-war, whereas a left-wing judge almost certainly wouldn't be. I went up to see Mum, who looked really bad. She'd lost half a stone in the last few weeks and was clearly worrying herself silly about me. It was all getting nasty though. Fiona was getting letters saying what's it like sleeping with a murderer. I was getting letters with fake blood on the envelopes.
Campbell is in France with his family as Lord Hutton begins calling witnesses. He will be one of them.
So it was definitely going to be another interrupted holiday. But hopefully it would be the last to be like this. Also, I was pretty desperate to be cleared. I needed to be at my best when I reached the witness stand. I'd had another night tossing and turning. I then just lay there waiting for the church bells to ring, and every time came the thought that they'd toll for me.
Lord Hutton then asks to see any relevant entries from Campbell's diaries.
The request came as a real shock. Now not only was I worried, but as I said to Fiona, Christ knows what I've written there.
The diary is couriered from London to Marseille, and Campbell drives out to collect it.
As I left the house and said goodbye to Fiona, I did actually wonder momentarily whether it would be the last time I saw her. Whether what I discovered on reading my own diary would be so awful that I would want to top myself. It was like a drama or a novel, and nobody had control of events. I tried not to be in a panic on the drive down, but I was. I was handed the package and set off back in the car. I drove for maybe half an hour and then pulled into a service station. I opened the envelope slowly and then pulled out the diary, put it down again and just stared at it. What I'd written in there, or so I felt, had the capacity to deliver vindication or destruction. One bad word and who knows, for me, for Tony, for the whole bloody government. At first glance it seemed fine, and I started to feel a bit better. A few bad bits, a bit too colourful in parts, but overall manageable. It then suddenly dawned on me, I'd been so focused on Kelly's death that I'd only got this year's diary sent out when of course it was last year that the dossier was put together. And it was clear from the inquiry team's letter that was absolutely central. I felt sick all over again.
The Hutton inquiry is well underway when Campbell and his lawyer, Jonathan Sumption, go through the diaries in France.
I was sort of hoping that his attitude would be, when in doubt, keep it out. It was the opposite. I found the whole experience really stressful, going over all the same ground again. I also felt a growing sense of injustice that I was the only witness having to do this, when I wanted just to be having a normal holiday with the family. And I just started sobbing. "I'm sorry," I said to Sumption, whose expression didn't really change. "It's all right," he said. "I totally understand why this is difficult."
Transcripts were made of the diary extracts, and Campbell returns to London to appear before Hutton.
When I left, Fiona was pretty cold with me. She said good luck, but with a "if you'd listened to me you wouldn't be in this mess" look on her face. "Sorry for ruining the holiday," I said. She smiled, shrugged and just said, "Do your best and get back as soon as you can." Grace was crying and later apparently asked the boys if I could go to jail. Callum was putting on a brave face and playing the hard man. "Never forget you're a Campbell, and nobody messes with our family." I got a message that there were people queuing outside the court overnight to try to get in. The thing had become a bloody circus.
Campbell stays overnight at Downing Street before going to the High Court.
I woke at 5 to Big Ben. It was so quiet. I thought of Fiona and the kids asleep, of Mum and Dad, and whether Dad would see out the year. I thought about Mrs. Kelly, and really wished I knew what she really thought about all this. I drove up as close as we could get to the court entrance. The demos were far bigger than we'd been led to believe. I walked straight through. They were shouting and screaming, but I'd got the blinkers on. Once I was there, I looked around at the lawyers and the people in front of the judge's bench, including a beautiful young woman just a few feet from me. She smiled really warmly, and I smiled back and decided, whenever I felt my hackles rise, I would just look at her. There was an interesting moment when James Dingemans, referring to a point in the diary where I said Gilligan would be f***ed, where I answered in a way designed to convey the meaning without using the word, and I could see a little smile at the corner of Hutton's mouth.
In his final few moments in the witness box before being driven away, Alastair Campbell said, "I have thought very, very deeply about the background of this, and I just want to say that I find it very, very sad."
When I was on the train to Gatwick, Tony called. He said he'd said a prayer for me this morning. So had Cherie, who sent me a note saying well done. I said it seems an age away, that I was sitting crying my eyes out going through the last days of July in my diary. It was fantastic to see the kids, and Fiona and I seemed to get on for the first time in ages.
A week later, after Blair has given his evidence to the inquiry, Campbell tells him he's stepping down, and the news provokes another frenzy.
Cheerio. Turning his back on number 10, the backroom boy who became more powerful, more famous than many who sat round the cabinet table.
There was a horde of media waiting in the street when we got home, more than I think we'd ever had. We had a nice evening, and Fiona was definitely more relaxed. And I sensed the kids, though annoyed at all the bollocks in the street every time they came and went, were feeling a change for the better was happening. As I left, Tony had said, "You do realise I will phone you every day, don't you?" I said yes, and I hope you realise sometimes I won't be there.